The courtroom was dead silent except for the sound of my daughter-in-law's voice cutting through the air like a knife. "You're nothing but a bitter old woman who can't accept that your son chose me over you," Sarah screamed, her face twisted with rage as she pointed her manicured finger directly at me. I sat there in my simple black dress, the same one I'd worn to my husband's funeral 3 years ago, watching as every person in that courtroom turned to stare. Some looked shocked. Others seemed embarrassed for me. But what none of them knew, what Sarah had no idea about, was that this moment had been exactly what I'd been waiting for. You see, for the past 2 years, I'd endured Sarah's calculated cruelty. The snide comments about my cooking, the way she'd roll her eyes whenever I spoke. How she convinced my son Michael to move across the country, claiming it was for his career, but really just to get him away from me. She thought she was so clever, so untouchable. But then something extraordinary happened in that courtroom. The judge, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes, looked up from his papers. His gaze fell on me, and I watched as his expression shifted from professional detachment to complete shock. His pen slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the wooden bench. "Margaret?" he whispered, so quietly that only those in the front row could hear. "Margaret Thompson?" The entire courtroom held its breath. Sarah's mouth hung open mid-sentence. My son Michael, who hadn't spoken to me in months, turned pale as a sheet. Even the court reporter stopped typing, her fingers frozen above the keys. I simply nodded, keeping my composure as I had for decades. "Hello, David." What happened next would change everything. But to understand how we got to this moment, how I orchestrated the perfect revenge that would bring my family back together and expose Sarah for who she truly was, you need to know the whole story. My name is Margaret Thompson, and I'm 72 years old. For most of my life, I was exactly what people expected me to be: a devoted wife, a loving mother, a quiet woman who kept her head down and her mouth shut. After my husband Robert passed away, I thought my purpose was simply to fade into the background of my son's life, to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention he threw my way. How wrong I was. This story begins 18 months ago, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. I was tending to my rose garden, the one Robert and I had planted together 40 years ago, when my phone rang. It was Michael, calling to tell me he was getting married. "Mom, I wanted you to hear it from me first," he said, his voice strangely formal. "Sarah and I are engaged." I should have been overjoyed. My only child, my baby boy, was starting his own family, but something in his tone made my stomach clench with worry. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," I managed to say. "When do I get to meet her properly?" There was a pause, a long, uncomfortable pause that spoke volumes. "Well, that's the thing, Mom. Sarah thinks it might be better if we kept things simple. You know, just immediate family at the wedding." I felt the words hit me like a physical blow. Immediate family. As if I, his mother, didn't qualify. "I see," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "It's nothing personal, Mom. Sarah just wants a small ceremony, you understand, right?" No, I didn't understand. I didn't understand how the son I'd raised alone after his father died when he was 12 could suddenly decide I wasn't important enough to witness the most significant day of his life. I didn't understand how a woman I'd met exactly twice could have such influence over him, but I said what mothers always say when their hearts are breaking. "Of course, darling. Whatever makes you happy." That phone call was just the beginning. Over the following months, the distance between Michael and me grew wider and wider. Sarah made sure of that. She had a gift for subtle manipulation, for saying things that sounded reasonable on the surface, but were designed to drive wedges between people. "Michael's been so stressed lately," she'd say during their rare visits. "I think all these family obligations are really weighing on him. Maybe we should give him some space to focus on his career." Family obligations, that's what she called my weekly phone calls with my son. Or she'd make comments about my age, delivered with a sweet smile that never reached her eyes. "It must be so hard for you, Margaret, living all alone in this big house. Have you thought about moving somewhere more manageable? Somewhere with other people your age?" She wanted me gone. Out of the house Robert and I had built together, away from the neighborhood where I'd lived for 40 years, isolated from anyone who might support me. The breaking point came 6 months ago. Michael called to tell me they were moving to Seattle. Sarah had gotten a promotion, he explained, and it was too good an opportunity to pass up. But what about your job here? I asked. I'll find something new. Sarah thinks a fresh start would be good for both of us. Sarah thinks. Sarah wants. Sarah decides. When had my son's life become so completely controlled by this woman? Will I see you before you leave? I asked, hating how desperate I sounded. Another pause. We're pretty busy with the move, Mom. But we'll call once we're settled. They moved 3 weeks later. I found out from a neighbor who saw the moving truck in their driveway. My son didn't even say goodbye. For months after that, I barely heard from them. A text message here and there. A brief phone call on my birthday that felt more like an obligation than genuine care. I started to wonder if this was just how it was going to be, if I'd spend my remaining years as nothing more than a fading memory in my son's life. But then something happened that changed everything. Sarah made a mistake, a big one. It was a cold morning in November when my doorbell rang. I opened it to find a young man in a suit holding an official-looking envelope. "Margaret Thompson?" he asked. "Yes, that's me." "You're being served with legal papers, ma'am." My hands shook as I read the documents. Sarah was suing me. She claimed that I'd been harassing them with phone calls and messages, that I'd been spreading lies about her to Michael's friends and coworkers, that my behavior was causing them emotional distress and damaging their marriage. It was all lies, of course. I'd barely contacted them at all. But Sarah was smart. She knew that the best defense is a good offense, and she was trying to cut me out of Michael's life permanently by painting me as an unstable, obsessive mother who couldn't let go. What she didn't know was that she'd just handed me the perfect opportunity for revenge. You see, there's something about me that Sarah never bothered to learn. Something that Michael had forgotten in all the years since his father died. Before I became just Mom, before I devoted my entire life to raising my son and supporting my husband's career, I had a life of my own. A very interesting life that was about to become extremely relevant. As I sat in my kitchen that November morning, staring at those legal papers, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not sadness, not defeat, but a cold, calculating anger that sharpened my mind like a blade. Sarah wanted to play games? Fine, but she had no idea who she was playing against. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in over a decade. My fingers trembled slightly as I listened to the ring, wondering if he would even remember me after all these years. "Law offices of Henderson and Associates?" came the crisp voice of a receptionist. "This is Margaret Thompson. I need to speak with James Henderson. Tell him it's about the Whitmore case." There was a pause, some muffled conversation in the background, and then a familiar voice came on the line. "Margaret, my God, is it really you?" "Hello, James. Yes, it's me." "I can't believe it. After all these years. How are you? I heard about Robert, and I'm so sorry for your loss." James Henderson had been my partner at the law firm where I'd worked for 15 years before Michael was born, back when I was Margaret Whitmore, one of the youngest and most ruthless corporate attorneys in the city, back when I could dismantle opposing counsel's arguments with surgical precision and walk away from million-dollar cases without breaking a sweat. "I'm well, James, but I have a problem and I need your help." "Anything, what's going on?" I explained the situation, reading him key passages from Sarah's lawsuit. I could hear him making notes, his pen scratching against paper in that familiar rhythm I remembered from countless late nights preparing cases together. "This is clearly frivolous," he said when I finished. "Harassment based on normal parental contact, emotional distress from birthday calls. Any competent judge will see right through this. That's what I'm counting on. But James, there's something else, something I need you to help me research." Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into preparation with an intensity I hadn't felt since my practicing days. James's private investigator uncovered Sarah's past, her financial records, her employment history. What we found was fascinating. Sarah Chen, age 28, originally from Portland. She'd changed her name from Sarah Kowalski 5 years ago, right around the time she'd been fired from her previous job for embezzling funds. She'd managed to land on her feet, reinventing herself completely, but she had debts. Serious debts that she'd been hiding from Michael. More interesting was her pattern with relationships. 3 previous engagements, all to men with money or family wealth, all ending abruptly once she'd gotten what she needed from them. Michael wasn't her first mark. He was just her latest. But the most crucial discovery came when James's investigator looked into the judge assigned to our case. The Honorable David Morrison had been appointed to the family court 6 months ago, transferred from criminal court after an exemplary 20-year career. When James showed me Judge Morrison's photograph, I felt my breath catch in my throat. I recognized those kind eyes, that distinguished face, though it was older now, weathered by decades of seeing humanity at its worst and best. David Morrison had been David Carver when I knew him, a young law student who'd worked as an intern at our firm during the summer of 1987. A brilliant, idealistic young man who'd wanted to change the world through the legal system. A young man I'd mentored, guided, and helped shape into the lawyer he would become. "James," I said quietly, "I need to tell you something about Judge Morrison. Something that changes everything." The weeks leading up to the court date passed in a blur of preparation. Sarah had hired an expensive attorney, someone flashy who specialized in family law and had a reputation for winning through intimidation rather than legal merit. She was confident, cocky even, certain that her youth and apparent vulnerability would win sympathy from the court. She had no idea what was coming. I chose my outfit carefully for the hearing. Not the expensive suits I'd once worn to court, but a simple black dress that made me look like exactly what Sarah wanted everyone to see. A harmless, elderly woman. I pulled my gray hair back in a modest bun and wore my late husband's simple gold wedding band. The performance began the moment I walked into that courtroom. Sarah's lawyer painted me as a bitter, interfering mother-in-law who couldn't accept her son's happiness. He presented a timeline of supposed harassment that was masterfully crafted fiction, phone calls that had never happened, messages I'd never sent, a pattern of behavior designed to make me look unstable and obsessive. "Your Honor," he said in his smooth courtroom voice, "my client has tried to maintain a relationship with Mrs. Thompson out of respect for her son, but the defendant's increasingly erratic behavior has left them no choice but to seek legal protection." I sat silently through it all, letting them build their house of cards higher and higher. My court-appointed public defender, a young woman fresh out of law school, did her best, but was clearly outmatched. She stumbled through objections and seemed genuinely confused by the complexity of Sarah's claims. That was exactly what I wanted. When it came time for Sarah to testify, she put on quite a performance, tears at just the right moments, a trembling voice when she described my supposed threats. She painted herself as a devoted wife trying to protect her husband from his toxic mother. "She calls at all hours," Sarah sobbed into her tissue. "She shows up at Michael's workplace causing scenes. She's told his co-workers terrible lies about me, trying to turn everyone against our marriage." It was all beautifully choreographed nonsense, but it was convincing. I could see some of the court staff nodding sympathetically. Even my own lawyer looked like she believed Sarah's story. Then came my turn to testify. I walked slowly to the witness stand, playing up my age, letting everyone see the frail grandmother that Sarah wanted them to see. The questioning began gently. My lawyer asked about my relationship with Michael, my attempts to stay in contact after he moved. I answered simply, honestly, letting the truth speak for itself. Then Sarah's lawyer stood up for cross-examination, and I knew this was the moment everything would change. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, with that condescending tone lawyers use when they think they have an easy target, "isn't it true that you've been unable to accept your son's marriage?" "No, that's not true." "Isn't it true that you've made repeated unwelcome contact with my client?" "I've made normal attempts to maintain a relationship with my son." He pressed harder, trying to rattle me, to make me lose my composure, but I'd been cross-examined by experts. I'd done the cross-examining myself hundreds of times. This amateur didn't scare me. That's when Sarah made her fatal mistake. Unable to contain herself any longer, watching her lawyer fail to break me down, she jumped to her feet and screamed those words that sealed her fate. "You're nothing but a bitter old woman who can't accept that your son chose me over you." The outburst was perfect. It revealed her true nature to everyone in that courtroom, shattering the carefully constructed image of the vulnerable victim. But more importantly, it gave Judge Morrison the opening he needed to really look at me. And that's when recognition dawned in his eyes. The moment Judge Morrison whispered my name, I knew Sarah's carefully constructed web of lies was about to unravel completely. But I wasn't ready to reveal my hand just yet. I had learned long ago that the most devastating victories come to those who wait for exactly the right moment to strike. "Your Honor," I said quietly, my voice carrying the authority I'd kept hidden for decades, "I believe there may be some confusion about my identity." Sarah's lawyer sensed something was wrong, but couldn't put his finger on what. He glanced nervously between the judge and me, his confident demeanor beginning to crack. Judge Morrison cleared his throat, struggling to maintain his professional composure. "Mrs. Thompson, would you please state your full legal name for the record?" "Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore Thompson, Your Honor." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear Sarah's sharp intake of breath behind me. Even she was beginning to realize that something fundamental had shifted in that courtroom. "And what was your profession before your marriage, Mrs. Thompson?" This was it, the moment I'd been building toward for months. "I was a senior partner at Whitmore, Henderson and Associates, Your Honor. I chose to focus on raising my family." The courtroom erupted. I specialized in corporate law and fraud investigation for 15 years before Sarah's lawyer dropped his legal pad. The court reporter's fingers flew across her machine as reporters in the gallery began whispering frantically among themselves. But my eyes remained locked on Judge Morrison, watching as the pieces fell into place in his mind. "The Margaret Whitmore?" he asked, his voice filled with something between disbelief and admiration. "The attorney who took down the Pemberton Industries fraud case? Who recovered over $200 million for pension fund victims?" "The same," I replied simply. Sarah had gone completely pale. She was staring at me as if I'd grown a second head, finally understanding that the harmless old woman she'd been manipulating for 2 years was anything but helpless. Judge Morrison leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are in the presence of one of the finest legal minds I've ever encountered. Mrs. Whitmore mentored me during my internship 25 years ago. She taught me that the law isn't just about statutes and precedents, it's about justice." Sarah's lawyer was scrambling now, trying to regain control of a situation that had spiraled completely beyond his grasp. "Your Honor, while Mrs. Thompson's past career is certainly impressive, it has no bearing on the harassment case we're here to address." That's when I decided it was time to play my ace. "Actually, Counselor, it has everything to do with this case. You see, when your client served me with this frivolous lawsuit, she made the mistake of awakening skills I thought I'd put to rest permanently." I reached into my purse and withdrew a thick folder that James Henderson had helped me prepare. "Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence that will show this entire case is not only without merit, but constitutes a deliberate attempt to commit fraud upon this court." Sarah's lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection! The defendant can't simply introduce new evidence without proper disclosure." Judge Morrison's voice was ice cold. "Overruled. Given the nature of the accusations and Mrs. Whitmore's reputation for thorough preparation, I'm going to allow this evidence. Proceed, Counselor." It felt natural calling me counselor again, like putting on a favorite coat after years in storage. I opened the folder methodically, the way I used to present cases to juries who held millions of dollars in their hands. "Your Honor, over the past 3 months, I conducted a thorough investigation into the plaintiff's background, financial situation, and pattern of behavior. I placed the first document on the evidence table. This is Sarah Chen's employment history, showing a pattern of job terminations related to financial irregularities, 5 different positions over the past 8 years, each ending with accusations of theft or embezzlement." Sarah was gripping the edge of her chair so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Her lawyer was frantically whispering in her ear, but she seemed unable to respond. "This second document shows Miss Chen's true financial situation. Despite claiming emotional distress from my supposed harassment, she has been systematically draining my son's bank accounts. Over $40,000 transferred to her personal accounts in the past 6 months alone." I could hear Michael gasp behind me. Finally, he was beginning to see what I'd known all along. "But most damning of all, Your Honor, is this recorded conversation between Miss Chen and her previous boyfriend, a Mr. Robert Hastings of Portland, Oregon." I activated the small digital recorder James's investigator had provided. Sarah's voice filled the courtroom, clear and unmistakable. "The old woman is completely clueless," the recording played. "Michael's wrapped around my finger, and she's got that big house just sitting there. Once I get rid of the mother, everything falls into place. These lonely widows are so easy to manipulate. The courtroom erupted again. Sarah lunged forward, screaming denials, but her voice was drowned out by the chaos. Michael had stood up, his face a mask of horror and betrayal as he stared at the woman he'd married. Judge Morrison slammed his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. When the room finally quieted, his voice carried the full weight of his authority. "Miss Chen, you and your counsel will approach the bench immediately." As Sarah stumbled forward on shaking legs, I felt a satisfaction deeper than any courtroom victory I'd ever achieved. This wasn't just about winning a case. This was about saving my son from a predator who would have destroyed him completely. But I wasn't finished yet. There was one more revelation that would ensure Sarah never had the opportunity to hurt anyone else again. "Your Honor," I continued, "there's one more thing the court needs to know. This isn't Miss Chen's first attempt at this particular scheme." I placed 3 more folders on the table. These are court records from Oregon, Nevada, and California. 3 other elderly women, all targeted by Miss Chen using identical methods: isolation from family members, financial manipulation, and when the victims became suspicious, frivolous harassment lawsuits designed to discredit them. Sarah collapsed into her chair, her carefully constructed facade crumbling completely. Her lawyer was gathering his papers, clearly preparing to withdraw from the case. "The pattern is always the same," I explained to the silent courtroom. "Find a lonely older woman with assets, befriend her adult children, drive a wedge between the family members, then systematically drain whatever resources you can access before moving on to the next victim." Judge Morrison's expression had grown darker with each revelation. "Miss Chen, do you have anything to say in response to these allegations?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "I want to speak to my lawyer." "Your lawyer appears to be leaving," the judge observed dryly as her counsel headed for the exit. That's when Michael finally found his voice. "Mom," he said from across the courtroom, his voice breaking with emotion, "I'm so sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry." I turned to look at my son, this man I'd raised and loved and nearly lost to a master manipulator. Tears were streaming down his face as he struggled to process the magnitude of what had been revealed. "I know, sweetheart," I said softly. "We'll talk soon." Judge Morrison was already drafting his ruling, his pen moving swiftly across the legal forms. "The plaintiff's case is dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the district attorney's office for investigation of potential fraud charges." He looked directly at Sarah, who seemed to shrink under his gaze. "Miss Chen, you are hereby ordered to cease all contact with the Thompson family. Any violation of this order will result in immediate arrest." But I wasn't done with my revenge yet. There was still one more surprise I'd been saving for exactly this moment. "Your Honor, if I may," I said, standing once again, "I have one final piece of business to address." The judge nodded, clearly curious about what else I might have prepared. I reached into my purse and withdrew a single sheet of paper. "This morning, I filed a countersuit against Miss Chen for fraud, emotional distress, and alienation of affection. I'm seeking damages in the amount of $500,000. Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes wide with terror. "You can't do that! I don't have that kind of money!" "No," I agreed calmly, "you don't. But you do have the engagement ring you convinced my son to buy, the one that cost $30,000 and was purchased with funds you'd stolen from his account." I smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd felt in months. "You see, Sarah, there's something you never understood about me. I don't just play to win. I play to ensure that predators like you never get the chance to hurt anyone else ever again." The bailiff was already moving toward Sarah as Judge Morrison signed the warrant for her arrest. Her schemes had finally caught up with her, and there would be no talking her way out of this one. As they led her away in handcuffs, Sarah turned back to scream at me one final time. "This isn't over, you crazy old witch!" I looked at her calmly, feeling nothing but pity for this broken woman who had tried to destroy my family. "Yes, Sarah," I said quietly. "It is." The courtroom began to empty, but Michael remained seated, staring at me with a mixture of awe and shame. He looked like the lost little boy he'd been after his father died, uncertain and afraid. Judge Morrison approached me as I gathered my papers, that same respectful expression he'd worn as a young intern all those years ago. "Margaret," he said quietly, "that was masterfully done. You haven't lost a step. Thank you, David. Though I have to admit, I'd hoped never to need these skills again. He nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes the greatest gifts we possess are the ones we pray we'll never have to use. As I walked toward the courtroom doors, Michael finally stood and called out to me. Mom, wait, please. I stopped walking but didn't turn around immediately. Part of me wanted to savor this moment, to let him feel the weight of what he'd put me through. But when I finally faced him, I saw my little boy again, the one who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. I don't know where to start, Michael said, his voice cracking. How do I apologize for 2 years of this? The courtroom had mostly emptied, leaving just the two of us in the echoing space where Sarah's lies had finally been exposed. I walked slowly toward him, my heels clicking against the marble floor. You start by understanding that I never stopped being your mother, I said softly, even when you chose to believe I was the villain in your story. Michael's face crumpled. She made it all seem so reasonable. Every time you called, she'd point out how you were being too clingy. When you wanted to visit, she'd remind me how awkward family dinners had become. She had an explanation for everything, and I was stupid enough to believe her. You weren't stupid, sweetheart. You were in love with someone who was very good at manipulation. He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his teenage years when he was struggling with difficult problems. How did you know? How did you figure out what she really was? I sat down in the front row of seats, suddenly feeling every one of my 72 years. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation was beginning to fade. A mother knows, I said simply. But more than that, Sarah made the mistake of thinking I was just another helpless old woman she could push around. She never bothered to learn who I really was. Michael sat beside me, maintaining a careful distance as if he wasn't sure he had the right to get closer. I can't believe you were Margaret Whitmore. All these years, and I never really understood what you'd given up to raise me. I didn't give it up, Michael. I chose to redirect my energy toward something more important, toward you, and I threw it all away for her. The pain in his voice was raw, genuine. This wasn't the distant, controlled son who had been screening my calls for months. This was my boy, finally seeing clearly after years of living in Sarah's carefully constructed fog. The important thing is that you see it now, I told him. Sarah was counting on our family staying broken. That was part of her plan, to isolate you from anyone who might recognize what she was doing. Michael was quiet for a long moment, processing everything that had happened. The recording, the financial records, all that evidence you presented. How long have you been planning this? Since the day she served me with those papers, she thought she was cornering a helpless old woman, but what she actually did was wake up a lawyer who'd spent 15 years taking down people just like her. I should have seen it, he said, shaking his head. The way she always had reasons why we couldn't visit you. How she'd get angry whenever I talked to you on the phone. The way she started controlling our finances. Sarah was very skilled at what she did, Michael. This wasn't her first time manipulating a family. You saw the evidence, the other victims. She'd perfected her techniques over years of practice. He turned to look at me directly for the first time since the hearing began. How can you forgive me? I chose her over you. I let her convince me that you were the problem in our relationship. Because that's what mothers do, I said, reaching over to touch his hand. We love our children even when they can't see past their own mistakes. Michael's eyes filled with tears again. I missed you so much, Mom. Even when I was angry, even when I believed everything Sarah was telling me, I missed talking to you. I missed you too, sweetheart. More than you'll ever know. We sat together in the quiet courtroom, two people slowly finding their way back to each other after being torn apart by someone who understood exactly how to weaponize love and trust. Sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones who reveal our greatest strengths. Sarah thought she was destroying a helpless old woman, but she actually awakened someone who refused to let family manipulation win. The best revenge isn't about getting even, it's about protecting the people you love and ensuring predators can't hurt anyone else. Never underestimate the quiet strength of someone who's been pushed too far.